Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is, of course, Michael Granado. I'm a history and philosophy educator with an interest in the history and philosophy of science. Specifically, this video, I've made numerous videos on my channel talking about the relationship between science and Christianity specifically, and kind of pushing back on this common argument that I oftentimes hear by apologists that Christianity played a unique role in the development and the history of science. And in this video, I'm going to be responding to a video that was recently released by Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones, titled "Which Religion Advanced Civilization More, Christianity or Islam?" And in his response, Jones is going to point to the fact that Christianity was uniquely situated to support to develop the beginning of modern science, and that subsequently, as a result, it's Christianity that advanced civilization more over and against, of course, Islam. Now, this is a bit complicated, as I've pointed out in my other videos, because this question about the relationship between science and Christianity is one that is immensely complicated and involves a very high level and depth of historical research. And specifically, some of the points that Michael brings up is not something that there is a clear consensus. And as I've mentioned in my other videos, in terms of my personal opinion on this, oftentimes when I'm giving this sort of pushback, it may come off as if I'm supporting what's known as the conflict thesis. I want to make clear from the beginning that I am not. The conflict thesis, or is this idea within the history of science that science and religion, specifically science and Christianity in the Western world, have been diametrically opposed to one another, that Christianity has actually hindered or prevented the progression of science. Now, there is a lot wrong with those sorts of claims, but the conflict thesis as a whole that was very popular in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and that is still popular in a lot of online communities today. It feels weird to say online community, a lot of online discussions today, but that meta-narrative has largely fallen out of favor from historians of science and has largely been refuted by, I'm not aware of any historian of science nowadays that holds that position. But in contrast to the conflict thesis, what we oftentimes see, especially by historians who are inclined more towards Christianity, and especially this is picked up on by a lot of apologists, is the move in the opposite direction, which is to suggest that Christianity is uniquely responsible for the development of modern science, or that Christianity played a special role in the development of modern science in a way that other religions did not. And by extension, it's putting some sort of, not putting, it's giving some sort of priority, whether epistemological, culturally, historically, a priority to Christianity over and against other religious traditions, to say that Christianity is unique, and by extension to apply a value judgment to the history of Christianity and its relationship to the history of science. Now, as Michael will point out, and Michael's really good at citing the sources where he's getting his information from, so hats off to Michael in that regard, there are some historians of science which support this idea, and I don't want to characterize or frame Michael as somehow misreading them or misreading the history of science. He's certainly reading these specific historians correctly in their claims about the nature of the relationship between science and Christianity. What I just want to point out is that there's not a consensus there. And a lot of these ideas hinge upon some important definitions and larger arguments that are very difficult to untangle, that I'm not really going to get to within the context of this video. One of the biggest things is, if you want to go read up on this, and I've touched upon this in other videos, is that a lot of historians, there's been a debate about the nature of what we call historical meta-narratives. Meta-narratives are these overarching narratives which connect large periods of history since the 60s and 70s, and meta-narratives have come under a lot of scrutiny. And the reason why that meta-narratives have come under a lot of scrutiny is the same reason why a lot of historians object to the conflict thesis. And that's simply because history is immensely complicated. And whatever historical meta narrative that a historian puts forward, it's very easy to find counter examples to that and to say, well, you're saying that science and religion are in conflict, but what about medieval universities, which actually fostered and developed and funded the natural science? You're saying that they're in conflict by pointing to the trial of Galileo. Well, what about the fact that Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, we're all very devout Christians, right? So any meta narrative is going to have inherent problems because of how complicated history is. But the claim that Christianity birthed modern science, Christianity specifically birthed modern science, is also a meta narrative, and it suffers from the same sorts of problems. So, first and foremost, we have these objections and debates about the nature of meta narratives that are actively happening within historical methodology today. But another big issue, and this one's a little bit harder to pinpoint, but there are a lot of complications surrounding the language that's being used to describe these time periods. And these complications can lead to misunderstandings. I recently made a video titled, "Was There a Scientific Revolution?" And this kind of illustrates the general point I want to make here. We like to use these labels and these phrases to describe historical time periods. And for the sake of simplicity, these may work, especially within a teaching context. When I teach modern history, I teach about the scientific revolution. But the fact of the matter is, we're labeling these specific periods. There's an element of arbitrariness. Is that a word? Arbitrariness of, there's an arbitrary aspect to these labels insofar as when you're dealing with intellectual movements, the historical periods that we're dealing with aren't incredibly cut and dry. And there's a whole diverse range of peoples, of influences, of technologies, of inventions, of political developments that are all happening around the same time that we're creating these artificial separations to say this and this alone was the scientific revolution. When in matter of fact, like I mentioned before, because of the complexity of history, once you start to examine it on a smaller level, it's incredibly difficult to do that. And the same is true with claims that Christianity birthed modern science, or that modern science came from, developed from assumptions, theologies, philosophical positions that are uniquely Christian. Because by making that claim, you're drawing those arbitrary lines. And I'm saying that those lines are arbitrary because it all hinges upon a large number of factors. First and foremost, what do we mean by Christianity? Because some people would want to claim that a specific branch of Christianity, Protestantism, Catholicism, that a specific branch of Christianity gave rise to modern science. So first and foremost, we have to offer some clarity about what exactly do we mean by Christianity, but that's a very minor point. The bigger point would be, what exactly do we mean by science? Because institutions and practices that look like science, maybe not modern science, again, one of those words that we have to clarify, but institutions and practices that look like science have developed historically across the globe. So, where are we drawing those demarcating lines? And that is a very complicated, tangled, messy process that is oftentimes just simply overlooked, simplified, and glossed over. Anyway, I am running my mouth way too much. Let's actually review some of the video here.
Which religion advanced Western civilization more, Christianity or Islam?
Well, if you listen to cringy TikTok atheists, the answer is neither. But if you read historians of science, the answer is very clear. It's Christianity.
So if you read historians of science, the answer is very clear: Christianity. Well, uh, that single statement was a big reason for me making that video, because that answer's not entirely clear, or at least it's not as clear as Michael is presenting it. Yes, almost every historian of science, including myself, who would look at this time period, would undoubtedly say that Christianity played a part in the development of modern science. However, again, however we're going to define that word. And I would even go as far as to say that Christianity played a big role in the development of science. Now, the development of science, I wouldn't necessarily use that language because development implies continuity. This is another meta narrative that I'll make a separate video unpacking what's called the continuity thesis, the idea that science has been consistent throughout its history, that we are seeing a gradual buildup and accumulation of scientific knowledge. There are some very serious challenges that are presented to that position, specifically by the philosopher Thomas Kuhn in his Nature of Scientific Revolutions. It's one of the most groundbreaking books within the philosophy, history and philosophy of science. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. But there are some issues with that assumption of continuity. On top of that, there are a lot of historians that would acknowledge many different other influences in the development of science other than Christianity. But here's the thing with how this issue is being framed and how that question's being asked, there are a lot of value judgments implicit in this question, which advanced civilization more, because depending upon how you answer that, you're going to position one of those religions over and against each other. And within the history of science, it's not a competition, and it's not a clear-cut question which advanced more. It's also not very clear what we mean by advanced here. The problem of language is the circular problem that goes all the way down, because advancement has its own value assumptions within the word. So yeah, it's not that clear cut, and it's not clear that all historians of science would say that Christianity advanced Western civilization more. That's not really language that most academic historians would use in their explanation and description of the past. Now, Michael will provide several citations, several which are coming from popular level history accounts, but by actual historians of science to support his claim there. But a lot of historians, especially within a professional academic setting, are going to be very, very hesitant to use that sort of value laden language to describe the historical period, to describe the rise and the development of modern science. Again, even those words, rise and development, a lot of historians wouldn't even use that language to talk about modern science. Now, I'm not really going to get into the person that Michael's responding to. I haven't seen the original video. I'm not familiar with the content creator there. I'm mostly going to be focusing on Michael's response to this individual.
And it's not even a question.
And what's your source for that?
You might be thinking that Europe made all of these advancements and they were Christian nations. And it's true, Europe was Christian and they made all of these scientific advancements, but they did that in spite of the church.
This is demonstrably false. Historians today note that Christianity was crucial for the development of science. James Hannum says even Christian theology turned out to be uniquely suited to encouraging the study of the natural world, which was believed to be God's creation. David Hutchings and James Ungureanu said, for an actual fact, no other body of thought has ever been of greater benefit to scientific thinking than the central tenets of traditional Christianity have in the whole of human history. Noah J. Efron said, generations of historians and sociologists have discovered many ways in which Christian beliefs and Christian institutions played crucial roles in fashioning the tenets, methods, and institutions of what in time became modern science. They found that some forms of Christianity provided the motivation to study nature systematically.
Yeah, so Michael provides some quotes to kind of support his position here. The first is by James Hannum, The Genesis of Science. In this book, Dr. Hannum is largely talking about the impact and the influence that the medieval ages, the quote, medieval ages had on the development of science. This is largely due to the misconception or the association of the medieval ages with the Dark Ages. There's a common assumption by people who haven't studied medieval history that medieval history was a time of development, of de-evolution of civilization, whatever the heck that means. But this book is an attempt to show that science actually flourished during this time period. And we have this quote here that Michael mentioned. I won't read the whole thing again, but the purpose of this quote to that point I just made is that the medieval ages provided some of the foundations that we would see that would later provide a pivotal role in the development of science. Of note here are medieval universities, the institutions that would provide the bedrock and the support. All of these universities that are playing a big part in the 16th and 17th century have their origins in medieval Europe. This is rebutting the conflict thesis that the church was trying to suppress science. The point here being that the church, typically speaking, funded science. So it's not a conflict, but it's a supporting. And then we have another quote here from David and James in their book of Popes and Unicorns. I've actually had the pleasure of having a conversation with both David and James on the channel Theology Unleashed. I'll link the video. I'll provide the link to that conversation in the description of this video. I actually had a chance to kind of walk through and unpack some of these questions and these problems that I'm raising here. Both David and James believe that Christianity played a unique role, but I got to kind of unpack some of the problems I have with the definition of science. My general argument within that conversation was that we have to kind of have a loose definition of science. This is arising primarily out of the problems of the philosophy of science that happened in the 20th century, specifically the problem of demarcation. As I've said in several other places, it's actually really difficult to provide a concrete definition of science. And this spills over into history, going back to the point I raised at the beginning of this video, because it's actually really difficult to say when exactly science started, or to point to one period of history and say this is science, and to point to another period of history and say this is not science. It was a very, I think, a very fruitful conversation, and I also got to explain a little bit why I think all of this matters. But I'll reference that. You can go back and watch that, specifically with respect to their book of Popes and Unicorns. It was a good read. I read through most of it prior to our conversation, and it's a good outline and critique of the conflict thesis, a really good history of the conflict thesis, how it developed, why it developed, all that good stuff. And then Michael cites another book, Galileo Goes to Jail. This is a collection of essays put together by the historian Ronald Numbers. I would highly, highly suggest it. It's one of my favorite kind of history of science book that appeals to a lot of people on a lot of different levels. It covers some of the famous myths of the history of science. As the title suggests, one of the chapters is dedicated to the trial of Galileo. I have a few videos on the trial of Galileo that was kind of inspired by that chapter. Again, I would highly recommend that book. It's an excellent source. I'm really glad that Michael cited it. But to that point, I want to read you a quote from not the author of the book. He was the editor of their book, although he did write an article within that book. His name is Ronald Numbers, one of the most prominent living historians of science. Numbers is really big, especially within the reception of Darwinism in early American history. He wrote a lot about the creationist controversies of the 19th, the creationist movement, the start of the creationist movement in the 19th century. So there's a lot of interconnectivity there with Christianity, especially within American history, and how that unfolded in the early 20th century with the Scopes trial, and of course, more recent modern developments in the 1960s with some of the court cases that happened about the teaching of creationism, and then more recently with the intelligent design controversy and some of the trials surrounding that. So if you're interested, especially in the relationship between Christianity and evolution, Ronald Numbers is your guy in terms of the history of the creationist movement. His book, The Creationist, S-tier book in the history of science. It's academic, but I would highly, highly recommend it. Anyway, in another book that he wrote called Science and Christianity in Pulpit and Pew, this is what Numbers has to say about the counter meta-narrative. There's not really a name for it. So on the one hand, you have the conflict thesis. On the other hand, you have this narrative that Christianity is uniquely responsible for the development of science. This is what Numbers has to say about that narrative. Another popular Just So story about science and Christianity portrays the latter, or one of its subdivisions, such as Protestantism or Puritanism, as the fountainhead of modern science. This interpretation received a boost in 1925 with the theistic philosopher Albert North Whitehead, in his Science in the Modern World, argued that Christianity, by insisting that nature behaves in a regular and orderly fashion, allowed science to develop. Understandably, many Christians have found this self-congratulatory view more attractive than the narrative of conflict. Despite the manifest shortcomings of the claim that Christianity gave birth to science, those shortcomings most glaringly, it ignores or minimizes the contribution of ancient Greeks and medieval Muslims. I've made this point in many of my other videos. If you want to go into a little bit more depth there, it too refuses to succumb to the death it deserves. The sociologist Rodney Stark at Baylor University, a Southern Baptist institution, is only the latest in a long line of Christian apologists to insist that, quote, Christian theology was essential for the rise of science. In the footnote, Numbers points out other historians of science who make similar arguments. So I bring that quote up for two reasons. One, to reemphasize that the counter meta-narrative to the conflict thesis is still a meta-narrative and still suffers from some of the same problems, specifically the problem of specific historical counter-evidence, and most importantly, the problem of all meta-narratives, which is an ambiguity of terms that are being used and an ambiguity of the lines of the demarcation that's happening on behalf of the author. So what we would need, what Michael would need to do, and what other historians who support this position would need to do is provide a lot of methodological clarification before they actually get into these claims, because these claims are not obvious. It's not explicitly clear when science, well, it's not explicitly clear what science is in the first place, or when it began in the first place, or why we are only limiting ourselves to Europe to talk about science and not other places. It's also not clear whether or not the scientific revolution, whether or not there was a scientific revolution in the terms of whether or not it's distinctive. This idea of continuity needs actual philosophical justification before we can just assume it to be a part of history. Anyway, back to Michael for the final point.
The GeoHooser is just simply wrong here. Christianity is the greatest pillar of modern science. Without it, science would not be what it is today.
Yeah, so this is one of the biggest unsupported claims of the video, that Christianity is the greatest pillar of modern science. So there's a lot to unpack with that statement, and there's a lot of questions I have for Michael with respect to that statement. First and foremost would be, well, what exactly do we mean by pillar here? What are the pillars of modern science? What are the other pillars of modern science? What does it mean to be a pillar of modern science? If by pillar you mean one of the origin points of modern science, then yes, again, undoubtedly Christianity is an origin point of modern science, but it's one of many origin points. To say that it's the greatest pillar of modern science, well, in order to make and to justify that sort of claim, you would need to compare it and contrast it with the other pillars of the development of modern science to kind of go along with this thought experiment. I would say would be the development of mathematics. The other pillars to go along with this thought experiment, and again, these, are subject to interpretation and debate, but again, I think there are some strong candidates here. The other pillars being the development, I'm pointing my fingers over here where you can't see it, the development of mathematics, the history of mathematics, how mathematics changed and evolved over thousands of years, of course, beginning and being rooted within ancient Greek mathematics. Euclidean geometry played to say that it's a pillar of modern science without Euclidean geometry, modern science is rooted in the development of mathematics, specifically the emphasis that's placed by Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler on mathematics, and the importance of mathematics in scientific argument is not something that you actually get within medieval history. In fact, this is one of the big shifts that take place. You see this, for example, in objections to Copernicus. Famously, the preface to Copernicus on the Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres, there's a mathematician named Rheticus who posthumously puts this into the book. Posthumous, after Copernicus had died, puts this in and says that, hey, listen, these are just mathematical hypotheses, because Copernicus's argument is the only reason why he has justification for it is the mathematics that he's providing. You see this in the debates that Galileo was having. I would reference Galileo's letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, in which he's arguing for the importance of mathematics. Of course, you have the debate between Kepler and the German mathematician Ursus over the nature of astronomical hypotheses. So the developments and role of mathematics, I would say, are hugely important. Again, that's not controversial at all. Modern science is also a reaction to the writing of Aristotle. Again, I've covered this in other videos, the rejection of Aristotelian cosmology, Aristotelian geography, biology. Again, we tend to focus on physics when we talk about the history of science, but a rejection of Aristotle. You also cannot underplay the other political and societal developments that are taking place, the other aspects of history, such as economic history, political history, that are all influencing and kind of converging in Europe in the 15th and 16th century. A major thing that I have here is the beginning of colonialism, the discovery of the New World, and the tremendous impact that that had on the development of science. So again, to say that Christianity is the greatest pillar of, yeah, that's going to need more explanation, more justification. And again, we have these weird sorts of value judgment, the greatest pillar. So it's a bigger influence than the history of mathematics. It's a bigger influence than the more accurate star charts that are being developed in the 15th century. It's a bigger influence than the non-Aristotelian cosmology that was developed by Muslim scientists in the Islamic Golden Age. It's a bigger influence than the observational data that was collected by Galileo with the invention of his telescope that directly refuted Aristotelian cosmology. Again, you got to unpack that a little bit. You got to tell me more in order to kind of justify those claims. Anyway, thank you for, that was a lot of me rambling. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions. Michael, I hope that if you see this, you've been on my channel before. I'm more than happy to have another conversation with you. I think this was a really interesting conversation. Obviously, I think that I've made like 5 or 6 videos about it. I love talking about the history of science. I love talking about this stuff. I enjoyed your video. I'm glad that you provided all those citations. Absolutely fantastic resources. Let me know if you want to chat. And for the rest of you, let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I will see you all next time. Thank you.